In 1555, Nostradamus stated, "In Germany shall diverse sects arise, coming very near to happy paganism. The heart captivated and small receiving shall open the gate to pay the true tithe." When we look back to the time before 1914, we find ourselves living in a world of events which would have been inconceivable before the war. We were even beginning to regard war between civilized nations as a fable, thinking that such an absurdity would become less and less possible in our rational, internationally organized world. And what came after the war was a veritable witches' Sabbath. Everywhere, fantastic revolutions, violent altercations of the map, reversions in politics to medieval or even antique prototypes, totalitarian states that engulf their neighbors and outdo all previous theocracies in their absolutist claims, persecutions of Christians and Jews, wholesale political murder, and finally we have witnessed a light-hearted piratical raid on a peaceful, half-civilized people. With such going on in the wide world, it's not in the least surprising that there should be equally curious manifestations on a smaller scale in other spheres. In the realm of philosophy, we shall have to wait some time before anyone is able to assess the kind of age we're living in. But in the sphere of religion, we can see at once that some very significant things have been happening. We need feel no surprise that in Russia, the colorful splendors of the Eastern Orthodox Church have been superseded by the movement of the godless. Indeed, one breathed a sigh of relief oneself when emerged from the haze of an Orthodox church with its multitude of lamps and entered an honest mosque, where the sublime and visible omnipresence of God was not crowded by a superfluity of sacred paraphernalia. Tasteless and pitiably unintelligent as it is, and however deplorable the low spiritual level of scientific reaction, it was inevitable that 19th century scientific enlightenment should one day dawn in Russia. But what is more than curious is that an ancient god of storm and frenzy, the long quiescent Wotan, should awake, like an extinct volcano, to a new activity in a civilized country that had long been supposed to have outgrown the Middle Ages. We have seen him come to life in the German youth movement. And right at the beginning of the blood of several sheep shed in honor of his resurrection. Armed with rucksack and loot, blonde youths, and sometimes girls as well, were seen as restless wanderers on every road from the North Cape to Sicily, violent votaries of the roving god. Later, towards the end of the Weimar Republic, the wandering role was taken over by thousands of unemployed, who were to be met with everywhere on their aimless journeys. By 1933, they wandered no more, but marched in the hundreds of thousands. The Hitler movement literally brought the whole of Germany to its feet, from 5-year-olds to veterans, and produced the spectacle of a nation migrating from one place to another. Wotan the Wanderer was on the move. He could be seen, looking rather shamefaced, in the meeting house of a sect of simple folk in North Germany, disguised as a Christ, sitting on a white horse. I don't know if these people were aware of Wotan's ancient connection with the figures of Christ and Dionysus, but it's not very probable. Wotan is a restless wanderer who creates unrest and stirs up strife, now here, now there, and works magic. He was soon changed by Christianity into the devil, and only living on in faded local traditions as a ghostly hunter who was seen in his retinue, flickering like a will-o'-wisp through the stormy night. In the Middle Ages, the role of the restless wanderer was taken over by Asurus, the wandering Jew, which was not a Jewish but a Christian legend. The motive of the wanderer, who has not yet accepted Christ, was projected on the Jews, in the same way as we always rediscover our unconscious psychic contents in other people. At any rate, the coincidence of anti-Semitism with the reawakening of Wotan is a psychological subtlety that may perhaps be worth mentioning. The German youths who celebrated the solstice with sheep sacrifices were not the first to hear the rustling of the primeval forest of the unconscious. They were anticipated by Nietzsche, Schuller, Stefan George, and Ludwig Klaus. The literary tradition of the Rhineland and the country south of the Main has a classical stamp that cannot be gotten rid of easily. Every interpretation of intoxication and exuberance is apt to be taken back to the classical models, to Dionysus, to the pure Atyrus, and the cosmogonic Eros. No doubt it sounds better to academic ears to interpret these things as Dionysus, but Wotan might be a more incorrect interpretation. He's the god of storm and frenzy, the unleasher of passions and the lust of battle. Moreover, he is a superlative magician, an artist in illusion, who is versed in all secrets of an occult nature. Nietzsche's case is certainly a peculiar one. He had no knowledge of Germanic literature. He discovered the cultural Philistine and announced that, quote, God is dead, which led to Zarathustra's meeting with an unknown god in an unexpected form, who approached him sometimes as an enemy and sometimes disguised as Zarathustra himself. Zarathustra, too, was a soothsayer, a magician, and the storm wind. He said, "And like a wind I shall come to blow among them, and with my spirit shall take away the breath of their spirit. Thus my future will sit. Truly a strong wind is Zarathustra, to all that are low. And his counsel gives he to his enemies and to all that spit and spew. Beware of spitting against the wind." And when Zarathustra dreamed that he was a guardian of the graves in the lone mountain of fortress of death, and was making a mighty effort to open the gates, suddenly a roaring wind tore the gates asunder, whistling, shrieking, and keening. It cast a black coffin before me, and amid the roaring and whistling, the shrieking, the coffin burst open and spouted 1,000 peals of laughter. The disciple who interpreted the dream said this to Zarathustra: "Are you not yourself the wind and with shrill whistling, which burst open the gates of the fortress of death? Are you not yourself the coffin filled with life's gay malice and angel grimaces?" In 1863 or 1864, in his poem To the Unknown God, Nietzsche had written, "I shall and will know thee, unknown one, who searchest out the depths of my soul, and blowest through my life like a storm, ungraspable, and yet my kinsman. I shall and will know thee, and serve thee." 20 years later, in his minstrel song, he wrote, "Minstrel wind, chaser of clouds, killer of gloom, sweeper of the skies, raging storm wind, how I love thee! And we are not both the first fruits of the same womb, forever predestined to the same fate?" In the dithyramb known as Eridan's Lament, Nietzsche is completely the victim of the hunter god, by saying, "Stretched out shuddering, like a half-dead thing whose feet are warmed, shaken by unknown fevers, shivering with piercing icy frost arrows, hunted by thee, O thought, unutterable, veiled, horrible one, thou huntsman behind the cloud, struck down by the lightning bolt. Thou mocking eye that stares at me from the dark, thus I lie, writhing, twisting, tormented, with all eternal tortures, smitten by thee, cruel huntsman, thou unknown God." This remarkable image of the hunter god is not a mere dithyrambic figure of speech, but is based on an experience which Nietzsche had when he was 15 years old at Forta. It is described in a book by Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche. As he was wandering about in a gloomy wood at night, he was terrified by a blood-curdling shriek from a neighboring lunatic asylum. And soon afterwards he came face to face with a huntsman whose features were, quote, wild and uncanny. Setting his whistle to his lips in a valley surrounded by wild scrub, the huntsman blew such a shrill blast that Nietzsche lost consciousness, but woke up again in Forta. It was a nightmare. It is significant that in his dream, Nietzsche, who in reality intended to go to Eisleben, Luther's town, discussed with the huntsman the question of going instead to Zuschenthal, the Valley of the Germans. No one with ears can misunderstand the shrill whistling of a storm god in the nocturnal wood. So, was it only the classical philologist in Nietzsche that led to the god being called Dionysus instead of Wotan? Or was it perhaps due to his fateful meeting with Richard Wagner. In his Reich und Raum, which was published in 1919, Bruno Goetz saw the secret of coming events in Germany in the form of a very strange vision. I haven't forgotten this little book, for it struck me at the time as a forecast of the German weather. It anticipates the conflict between the realm of ideas and life. Between Wotan's dual nature as a god of storm and a god of secret musings, Wotan disappeared when his oaks fell and reappeared again when the Christian god proved to be too weak to save Christendom from fratricidal slaughter. When the Holy Father of Rome could only impotently lament before God the fate of the Grex Sigritatis, the one-eyed old hunter on the edge of the German forest laughed and saddled Sleipnir. We're always convinced that the modern world is a reasonable world, basing on our opinion on economic, political, and psychological factors. But if we may forget for a moment that we are living in the year 1936, and laying aside our well-meaning, all too human reasonableness may burden God or the gods with the responsibility for contemporary events instead of man, we would find Wotan quite suitable as a casual hypothesis. In fact, I venture the heretical suggestion that the infallible events of Wotan's character explain more of a national socialism than all three reasonable factors put together. There is no doubt that each of these factors explains an important aspect of what is going on in Germany, but Wotan explains more. He is particularly enlightened in regard to a general phenomenon which is so strange to anybody, not a German, that it remains incomprehensible, even after the deepest reflection. So perhaps we may sum this up to general phenomena as Ergriffenheit, a state of being seized or possessed. The term postulates not only Ergriffener, one who is seized, but also Ergriffer, one who is seized. Wotan is an Ergriffer of men, and unless one wishes to defy Hitler, which has indeed actually happened, he is really the only explanation. It's true that Wotan shares this quality with his cousin Dionysus, but Dionysus seems to have been exercised his influence mainly on women. The Maenads were a species of female stormtroopers, and according to mythical reports, were dangerous enough. Wotan confined himself to the berserkers, who found their vocation as the black shirts of mythical kings. A mind that is still childish thinks of the gods as metaphysical entities, existing in their own right, or else regards them as a playful or superstitious inventions. From either point of view, the parallel between Wotan, Redevisus, and the social, political, and psychic storm that shook Germany might have the least the value of the parable. But since the gods are without doubt personifications of psychic forces to exert their metaphysical existences, is such an intellectual presumption as the opinion that they could never be invented. Not that psychic forces have anything to do with the conscious mind, fond as we are of playing with the idea that consciousness and psyche are identical. This is the only piece of intellectual presumption. Psychic forces have far more to do with the realm of the unconscious. Our mania for rational explanations obviously has its roots in our fear of metaphysics, for the two are always hostile brothers. Hence anything unexpected that approaches us from the dark realm is regarded either as coming from outside and therefore is real, or else as an hallucination and therefore not true. The idea that anything could be real or true which does not come from the outside has hardly begun to dawn on contemporary man. For the sake of better understanding and to avoid prejudice, we could of course dispense the name Wotan and speak instead of the Führer Teutonicus. But we should be only saying the same thing, and not as well, for the Führer in this case is a mere psychologizing of Wotan. and tells us more than that the Germans are in a state of fury. We thus lose the sight of the most peculiar feature of this whole phenomena, namely the dramatic aspect of the Ergreifer and the Ergriffener. The impressive thing about the German phenomena is that one man, who's obviously possessed, has infected a whole nation to such an extent that everything is set in motion and has started rolling on its course towards perdition. It seems to me that Wotan hits the mark as a hypothesis. Apparently he really was only asleep in the Kriffhauser mountain until the ravens called him and announced the break of day. He is a fundamental tribute of the German psyche, an irrational psychic factor which acts on the high pressure of civilization like a cyclone and blows it away. Despite their crankiness, the Wotan worshippers seem to have judged things more correctly than the worshippers of reason. Apparently everyone that forgotten that Wotan is a Germanic datum of importance, the truest expression and unsurpassed personification of a fundamental quality that is particularly characteristic of the Germans. Houston Stuart Chamberlain is a symptom which arouses suspicion that other veiled gods may be sleeping elsewhere. The emphasis on the Germanic race, commonly called Aryan, the Germanic heritage, blood and soil, the Wagalia songs, the Ride of the Valkyries, Jesus is a blonde and blue-eyed hero, the Greek mother of St. Paul, the devil as an international Alberic in Jewish and Masonic guise, the Nordic aurora borealis as the light of civilization, the inferior Mediterranean races. All this is the indispensable scenery for the drama that is taking place, and at the bottom, they all mean the same thing. A god has taken possession of the Germans, and their house is filled with a mighty rushing wind. Soon after, Hitler seized power, if I'm not mistaken, a cartoon premiered in Punch of a raving berserker tearing himself free from his bonds. A hurricane has broken loose in Germany. Well, we still believe it's all fine weather. Things are comparatively quiet, in Switzerland. Though occasionally there is a puff of wind from the north or south, sometimes it has a slightly ominous sound. Sometimes it whispers so harmlessly or even idealistically that no one is alarmed. Let the sleeping dogs die. We manage to get along pretty well with this proverbial wisdom, but it's sometimes said that the Swiss are singularly averse to making a problem of themselves. I must rebut this accusation. The Swiss do have their problems, but they would not admit it for anything in the world. Even though they see which way the wind is blowing, we pay our tribute to the time of the storm and stress in Germany. But we never mention it, and this enables us to feel vastly superior. It's above all the Germans who have opportunity, perhaps unique in history, to look into their own hearts and learn that whose perils of the soul were from which Christianity tried to rescue mankind. Germany is a land of spiritual catastrophes, where nature never makes more than a pretense of peace with the world-ruling reason. The disturber of peace is a wind that blows into Europe from Asia's vastness, sweeping in on a wide front from Thrace to the Baltic, scattering the nations before it dries like leaves. Or inspiring thoughts that shake the world to its foundations. It's an elemental Dionysus breaking the Apollyon. The rouser of, this tempest is named Wotan, and we can learn a good deal from him with this political confusion and spiritual upheaval that he has caused throughout our history. For a more exact investigation of his character, however, we must go back to the age of myth, which did not explain everything in terms of man and his limited capabilities, but sought deeper, because in the psyche and its autonomous powers, man's earliest intuitions personified these powers. Man's earliest intuitions personified these powers as gods, and described them in the myths with great care and Circumstantially, according to their various characters, this could be done the more readily on account of the firmly established primordial types or images which are innate in the unconscious of many races and exercise a direct influence upon them. Because the behavior of race takes on its specific character from its underlying images, we can speak on an archetype, Wotan. As an autonomous psychic factor, Wotan produces effects in the collective life of people and therefore reveals his own nature. For Wotan has a peculiarly biology of his own, quite apart from the nature of man. It's only from time to time that individuals fall under the irresistible influence of this unconscious factor. When it's quiescent, one is more aware of the archetype Wotan than of a latent epilepsy. Could the Germans who were adults in 1914 have foreseen what they would have today? Nor whither it goeth. Such amazing transformations are the effect of the god of wind. It seizes everything in its path and overthrows everything that is not firmly rooted. When the wind blows, it shakes everything that is insecure, whether without or within. Martin Nink has published a monograph, which is most welcome addition to our knowledge of Wotan's nature. The reader doesn't need to fear that this book is nothing but a scientific study written in academic aloofness from the subject. Certainly, the right to scientific objectivity is fully preserved, and the material has been collected with extraordinary thoroughness and presented in a usually clear form. But over and above all, one feels that the author is vitally interested in it, and the chord of Wotan is vibrating in him, too. This is no criticism, but on the contrary, it's one of the chief merits of the book, which perhaps without the enthusiasm might easily have been degenerated into a tedious catalog. Nink sketches a really magnificent portrait of the German archetype Wotan. He describes him in about 10 chapters, using all the available resources as the berserker, the god of storm, the wanderer, the warrior, the god, the lord of the dead, and so on. Neither the Valkyries nor the Figlia are forgotten, for the foreign part of the mythological background and fateful significance of Wotan. Nink inquiries to the name and the origin, which is particularly instructive. He shows that Wotan is not a god of rage and frenzy who embodies the instinctual and emotional aspect of the unconscious. Its intuitive and inspiring side also manifests in him, for he understands the runes and can interpret fate. The Romans identified Wotan with Mercury, but this character does not correspond to the Roman or Greek god, although there are some certain resemblances. He's a wanderer like Mercury, for instance. He rules over the dead like Pluto and Kronos. He's connected with Dionysus by his emotional frenzy, particularly in his mantic aspect. It is surprising that Nink doesn't mention Hermes, the god of revelation, who as Numa and Nous is associated with the wind. He would be connecting Link with the Christian Numa and the miracle of Pentecost. As Poimandres, the shepherd of men, Hermes is an eargriffer like Wotan. Nink rightly points out that Dionysus and the other Greek gods always remained under the supreme authority of Zeus, which indicates a fundamental difference between the Greek and the Germanic temperament. Nink assumes an inner affinity between Wotan and Kronos, and the latter's defeat may be a sign that the Wotan archetype was once overcome and split up in prehistoric times. At all events, the German god represents a totality on every primitive level. A psychological condition in which man's will was almost identical to the gods and entirely at his mercy. But the Greeks had gods who helped man against other gods. Allfather Zeus himself is not far from the ideal of a benevolent, enlightened despot. It wasn't in Wotan's nature to linger on, and it shows signs of old age. He simply disappeared when the times turned against him, and remained invisible for more than 1,000 years, working anonymously and indirectly. Archetypes are like riverbeds, which dry up when the water deserts them. It can find itself again in time, but an archetype is like an old watercourse along which the water has life has flowed for centuries, digging a deep channel for itself. The longer it's flowed in this channel, the more likely it is sooner or later the water will return to its old bed. The life of the individual as a member of a society, and particularly as a part of the state, may be regulated like a canal, but the life of nations is a great rushing river, which utterly beyond human control, in the hands of one who has always been stronger than men. The League of Nations, which was supposed to possess supernatural authority, is regarded by some as a child in need of care and protection, by others as an abortion. The life of nations rolls on unchecked without guidance and conscious of where it is going, like a rock crashing down the side of a hill, until it's stopped by an obstacle longer than itself. Political events move from one impasse to the next, like a torrent caught in gullies, creeks, and marshes. All human control comes to an end when the individual is caught in a mass movement. Then the archetype begins to function, as happens also in the lives of individuals when they are confronted with situations that can't be dealt with in any of the familiar ways. But what a so-called Führer does with a mass movement can plainly be seen with our eyes to the north or south of a country. The ruling archetype doesn't remain the same forever, as is evident from the temporal limitations that have been set by the hoped foreign of peace, the 1,000-year Reich, the Mediterranean father archetype of the just, order-loving, benevolent ruler that had been shattered over the whole of Northern Europe, as the present fate of the Christian churches bears witness. Fascism in Italy and the Civil War in Spain show that the South, as well as Catholicism, has been far greater than one expected. Even the Catholic Church can no longer afford trials of strength. The nationalist God has attacked Christianity at a broad affront. In Russia, he's called technology and science. In Italy, Deus, and in Germany, German faith, German Christianity, or the state. The German Christians are a contradiction in terms and would do better to join Hauer's German faith movement. These are decent and well-meaning people who honestly admit they're Urgriffinite and try to come to terms with this new and undeniable fact. They go to an enormous amount of trouble and make it look alarming by dressing up in a conciliatory historical garb and giving us consoling glimpses of great figures such as Meister Eckhart, who was also a German and also Ergriffen. In this way, the awkward question of who is the Ergriffer is circumvented, and he was always God. But the more Hauer restricts the worldwide sphere of Indo-European culture to the Nordic in general and to the Edda in particular, and the more German his faith becomes as a manifestation of Ergriffenheit, the more painfully evident it is that the German God is the God of the Germans. One can't read Hauer's book without emotion if one regards it as the tragic and really heroic effort of a conscious scholar who, without knowing how it happened to him, was violently summoned by the inaudible voice of an Ergriffer, who is now trying with all his might and with all his knowledge and ability to build the bridge between the dark forces of life and the shining world of historical ideas. But what do all the beauties of the past, from totally different levels of culture to the man of today, when confronted with the living and unfathomable tribal God, such as he has never been experienced before? They're sucked like dry leaves into the roaring whirlwind, and the rhythmic alliterations of the Edda became inextricably mixed up with Christian mystical texts, German poetry, and the wisdom of the Upanishads. Hauer himself is Ergriffen, by the depths of meaning in the primal words lying at the root of the Germanic language. to an extent that he never knew before. However, the Indologist is not to blame for this, nor yet the Edda. It's really the fault of Kairos, the present moment in time, whose name on closer investigation turns out to be Wotan. I would therefore advise the German faith movement to throw aside their scruples. Intelligent people who will not confuse them with crude Wotan worshippers whose faith is a mere pretense. There are people in Germanic faith movement who are intelligently enough not only to believe, but to know that the God of the Germans is Wotan and not the Christian God. This is a tragic experience and no to grace. It's always been terrible to fall into the hands of a living God. Yahweh is no exception to this rule, and the Philistines, Edomites, Amorites, and the rest who were outside the Yahweh experience must certainly have found it exceedingly disagreeable. The Semitic experience of Allah was for a long time an extremely painful affair to the whole of Christendom. We stand outside the judge of the Germans far too much, as if they're responsible agents, but perhaps it would be nearer to the truth to regard them as victims. If we apply admittedly peculiar points of view consistently, we're driven to conclude that Wotan must in time reveal not only the restless, violent, stormy side of his character, but also his ecstatic and manic qualities. A very different aspect of his nature. And this conclusion is correct, National Socialism would not be the last word. Things must be concealed in the background which we cannot imagine at present, but we may expect them to appear in the course of the next few years or decades. Wotan's weird awakening is a stepping back into the past. The stream was dammed up and has broken into its old channel, but the obstruction will not last forever. It's a rather peculiar pour mich sauter, and the water will overlap the obstacle. Then at last we shall know what Wotan is saying when he murmurs with Mimir's head. Fast move the sons of Mim, and fate is heard in the note of the Gallahorn. Loud blows Heimdall, the horn is aloft, and fear quake all who on hell roads are. Yggdrasil shakes and shivers on high, the ancient limbs, and the giant is loose. Wotan murmurs of Mimir's head. But the kinsmen of Surt shall slay him soon. How fare the gods, how fare the elves? All Jotunheim groans, the gods are at council. Loud roar the dwarves by the doors of stone, the masters of the rocks. Would you know yet more? Now Garm howls loud before Nipperhill. The fetters will burst, and the wolf run free. Much I do know, and more can see, of the fate of the gods, the mighty in fight. From the east comes Hrym, with shield held high. In giant wrath does the serpent writhe. O'er the waves he twists, and the tawny eagle gnaws corpses screaming. Naglfar is loose. O'er the sea from the north here sails a ship. With the people of hell at the helm stands Loki. After the wolf do wild men flow, and with them the brother of Bylist goes.